Alex at Crimson Corpus. These are our YouTube channels. How you doing, Alex?
Pretty good, James.
Okay, so this is our first broadcast, if you will, and we absolutely don't know what we're doing when it comes to broadcasting, but we're going to give it a test run and see if we can get things done. We're just going to be talking about basically random topics, whatever we want to talk about, and hopefully you enjoy it. Alex, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, well, our previous attempt at making a Google Hangout video was the subject was the archons, and I think we're starting to get into stuff about politics and how the archons kind of, well, how the archons are defined in Gnosticism and how it affects how we experience daily life.
Right, but now we have all that juicy info from yesterday that the Pope resigned.
Yeah, that was a really interesting twist. We have the Pope himself saying, "Oh, I don't want to be a Pope anymore." So,
Right.
and now we have Peter of Ghana who's going to be
Yeah. I guess he thought it wasn't all it was cracked up to be.
he's like, I don't want to be an Archon anymore. I think I'll give that.
I'm gonna try not to tamper with those buttons, but they're tempting. They're too tempting. Okay, so when we attempted to record last time, and turns out we didn't hit the broadcast, or I didn't hit the broadcast button because I was born under a rock and you know don't know what I'm doing here. Don't even have a professional mic, but anyway, we're gonna go over what the archons are in Gnosticism. We'll maybe go over some of the little tantalizing details about the Pope, but and lightning striking the Vatican supposedly right
Yeah, that
after he
was
resigned.
yeah, that's not.
I see thee, Lucifer, fallen from heaven.
Yahweh's
He
upset.
fell like lightning. Which is apparently what happened. Apparently Lucifer just fell into the Vatican, or it just turns out maybe the Pope is really Emperor Palpatine. He's conducting lightning wars in there. I don't know what's really going on, but that seems to be the case.
The Sith.
Yeah, he's a Scythian.
Yeah, they're all these Siths.
Which, if you look in some of the translations of Hippolytus, the majority of the text says Sethian, but there is one reading that renders it Scythian, which I've found interesting. But anyway, that's probably a little bit too esoteric for some of our viewers to even grasp what I'm talking about. But so with the archons, we'll begin with the archons. Hopefully, we can dovetail into other things like the demiurge, maybe the Book of Enoch or something, or ancient pagan documents or something. Who knows? Anything can happen. We're just gonna go off on tangents here, basically. But we'll start off with the archons and try to keep some order to this, and maybe we'll go into kind of how the Gnostics, or different groups of Gnostics, whatever. We're just going to look at Gnostics in general right now. How different groups viewed archons, what they were, what do they do, where did they come from, whatever. Any question we could get on it. So I guess I'd start off by asking you what essentially are different ways of expressing what archons are. What are they?
Well, first of all, the word archon is a Greek word for ruler. It's a general term for ruler. Back then, in the ancient period, it was commonly applied to governmental authorities and religious authorities. But Paul, Saint Paul, he uses the term to reference spiritual entities, which are particularly negative ones. I mean, when in Ephesians he talked about the dark rulers ruling high places, and the struggle isn't exactly against flesh, but it's against the powers and the authorities. I mean, in the Gnostic Gospels or the Nag Hammadi library, there's other terms that are used for the archons, like governors or
Powers,
robbers,
authorities, principalities.
gatekeepers,
Right.
judges, the pillars.
Tolkien. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you see that in like the Apocalypse of James, and Hypostasis of the Archons is interesting too, because it doesn't actually call them archons one time in the text, only in the title.
Yeah, it's just the authorities.
Right.
It's just simply authorities.
The authorities is from what I've noticed is the most common actually. Um, Out of the like that's the majority from what I've seen in the text. Not
Hmm.
necessarily, from any kind of statistical reference, but the majority that I've noticed over the last few days looking at it is mostly authorities or
Right.
powers. Archon's kind of less common.
Hmm.
But what exactly are archons otherworldly entities? Are they physical entities? Where do they exist? Where do they operate? Are they you talk about governors or princes and stuff like that. A
Well,
principality has a prince over it. It's ideas of kind of worldly figures too. So is it worldly, otherworldly, or is it both?
it can be well, like I said earlier, like we can see an archon, say in politics. We have these different governors,
Mm-hmm.
presidencies. I mean, they're in a sense archons, but when we talk about the Gnostic archons, I mean, I mean, there's lots of different views. I mean, like if you look at the text, the Apocryphon of John, talk about these animal-headed theomorphic entities that are basically like
Right.
fallen angels.
Kind of like they kind of seem like Egyptian gods.
Yeah, like they basically use what the Greeks call Hermione, which is fate, to kind
Right.
of rule over the affairs of mankind. They're constantly kind of like looking over, kind of intruding in the affairs of man, even though man is pretty much ignorant of their existence.
It seems like they kind of have the view, like with the Greeks, where the Greeks had this very negative view. Or at least a lot of the Greek writers have a very tragic, negative view of the pagan gods, where it's like,
Hmm.
um, curse the gods because they've tampered with the lives of men and stuff like that.
Yeah, the Cynics were really like that, and they hated
Mm.
the Greek gods and kind of the whole Greek astrology and how it controls everything. Because we're born if we're born a certain date, then we die on a certain date, and apparently the Gnostics kind of had a formula of how to figure out how when how our fate is determined by simply when we're born. Um,
Right.
because we're always born on a different zodiacal zodiac sign, um, and of course these powers kind of rule over these signs, and then we're kind of under this rule called fate.
Mm.
Uh, a lot of texts like I think it's a trimorphic progenoia, which is kind of a Sethian Neoplatonic text to talk about uh, yeah, basically how the logos. So I'm kind of going kind of a little off tangent here, but how the logos kind of disrupts the activities of the archons, and you kind of see that again in the tripartite tractate.
Right. The tripartite tractate. Yeah. Oh man, I just
Yeah,
got done reading that completely for the first time. Before we did our practice run last time, and the tripartite tractate is it's an anomaly, man. It's out there. It's different. It's very Gnostic inspired. It's got like kind of a Valentinian tinge to it, but it's definitely very different. Sophia becomes the logos, and you have a higher logos and a lower logos, and just all this really kind of weird stuff. And you actually have original sin. It's one of the texts that actually explicitly mentions original sin, kind of like what was it called? It was the Life of Adam and Eve, which I think may be the Gospel of Adam and Eve that was referred
hmm
to by early church fathers. There's no scholarly consensus on that. It just seems like that's a possibility.
right. Uh, I mean, like you definitely see a lot of Orthodox influence in that
Right.
tripartite tractate. I mean, you have this condemnation of the serpent as the Hylic power,
Right.
um, but at the same time, it doesn't really paint the demiurge in any good light, really.
Right.
Anyway, I mean, it's really strange that text, but it's a late Valentinian writing. But at the same time, It could be just like an Orthodox writer trying to
Right. I
do
think it's just
not.
orthodox and it's inspired
Yeah.
by some sort of Valentinianism. We don't know exactly what, and it also it has innumerable aeons in it,
Mhm.
which is one of the things that makes it very non-Valentinian, because they knew the number of them. There's 32 total. So, um, what's interesting too with these archons is that you have this idea in Orthodoxy of archangels. Could you tell us what it would mean to say archangel? What does that actually mean?
Well, first of all, the word angel, I mean, it's just a general term for messenger, um,
Right,
messenger of God. But when Paul talks about the angels, he doesn't really see them as anything special. In fact, he
right,
kind of goes and talks through a lot of negative references
right,
to the angels. Yeah, he's like he talks about how in which you formerly walked according to the eternal being, God of this cosmos, according to the
right,
arcana power of the air.
right,
Um, he's not like a lot of times he's not referring to angels as good beings. It's just like powers that are
right,
basically kind of pretty much at war with humanity. I mean, and then you
right,
have and then you have he paints Jesus as the one who kind of deceives the angels and the
right. Like
authorities.
he's the one that stole their power, basically.
Yeah,
With the angels, like what you're saying, yeah, and Paul, like in Second Corinthians and Ephesians, there's very low views of them. In fact, all throughout his letters, but whereas in Revelation, there's a very high view of angels. In fact, Revelation is said to be given by an angel, which Paul had a total problem with because Paul said he got his revelation directly from Christ,
right.
whereas this guy calling himself John um, says he got it from an angel. Like when you look in Revelation, um, directly at the beginning, he's talking about that. He says the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants what must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John, who testifies to everything he saw. That is the word of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ. So you see here that John, here this guy saying he's John, is such a cheapskate that he couldn't get a revelation directly from Christ. It had to be sent to him by an angel, which is a heavenly messenger.
Right.
And then there's even the idea that heaven essentially is just the sky for these people. For Paul, I mean, heaven is another whole other realm. It's a
Yeah, it's a
spiritual place,
yes, the dimension radically different from the material world.
right?
Um,
And he calls it the pleroma too. He calls it the fullness,
yeah, especially when you read Paul in Greek, I mean, it's
right?
very Gnostic. I mean, you using like
Very.
terms like Sophia, the authorities, the priesthood.
So in a way, an archangel, would you say, is a because you could call an archon a chief too, or a ruler,
Hmm.
right? Would you say that an archangel is like a chief heavenly messenger, a chief,
Uh,
messenger?
I mean, you could say that. I mean, just well, so many kind of terms you could use, but I mean, like apparently there's I don't know if it's pseudo Dionysus who came up with the different hierarchies of archangels, but yeah, the seraphim, the cherubim, and all these different um,
Right. Those are found
classes
in
of
the
angels.
Old Testament. I'm
Yeah,
pretty sure. I think the seraphim is in the Old Testament.
yeah, and I think we were talking about this earlier. I mean, Ezekiel talks about how the cherubim are like also animal-headed
Right.
entities. Eagle head is the lion head, and so they're kind of like the archons.
Right, which is interesting because Irenaeus takes that kind of stuff to mean that he ties that directly into Revelation because Revelation obviously hijacks a lot of things from Ezekiel and
Hmm.
and pretty much a lot of the prophets, not all of them, but a lot of them. And he kind of hijacks that idea that there's a lion, there's a ox, or I think it was, and there's a eagle and a man, and or something like that. And the creatures aren't always exactly the same. Some of them are a little off, but Irenaeus takes that to mean that there's the four gospels, which later writers take too, and they mix it up. And
Right.
the eagle's no longer John; it's Matthew or something.
Hmm.
Um, what's funny with that though is you have the eagle idea, right? And that's supposed to be John. Um, but yet these are beasts. And
Hmm.
then you have the beast, the four beasts. But the four beasts are the eagle and the you know and the ox in Revelation. So those four beasts get reinterpreted into these evil things, but originally in the beginning of it they're good. So you can tell you've got two authors kind of not working together here.
What's interesting, I mean, the theme of the beast, you see it as imagery used as the archons, and of course the so-called hylics. What
Right.
our viewers who are not familiar with the kind of the terminology, the hylic is basically a person, a material, strictly a material person.
Right, like a
Um,
materialist,
yeah, materialist.
a
Um,
Democritus, or an
yeah,
Epicurus, an Epicurean.
yeah,
Someone who believes that there is no soul or spirit, everything's inseparably one, the universe has been around forever, and people have never evolved, they've always been exactly the same.
yeah. You see that. I mean, like, I think there's one text called Marsanes. It says,
Right,
but their powers, which are the angels, are in the form of beasts and animals. So, I mean, that this theme of the angels and as well as people as being animalistic beings are, I mean, keeps repeating over and over again. So I
right.
mean, it definitely repeats itself.
Now, how many, when it comes to, now I know you said that there's archons that are, real rulers like Barack Obama or a senator or a governor or,
Right.
a president, a king, whatever, anyone who's in a civil position of power, as well as, could that be applied to, rulers of the church as well, like a bishop?
Right.
Okay, so you can apply that to bishops. You can apply that to any kind of civil authority, maybe even the head of a synagogue or something. Now, aside from that, when you're looking at these heavenly spiritual type entities that are archons, maybe that they possess these people or something, these heavenly archons, how many of them, typically, how many do they enumerate? How many do they have?
Well, there's a lot of different systems. I mean, in the Sethian Gnostic system, you have 365 angels or
Right.
archons, but it repeats itself with the system of 365 aeons as well.
Right, and some of them even have where there's seven chief archons, and then they created all
Yeah,
these other angels.
yeah. The word, the number seven repeats itself a lot. I mean, you have
Does that coincide with the idea of like the kings of hell, like what you find in the Gospel of Nicodemus?
yeah. I think it might because
Yeah,
even the Gospel of Judas kind of goes into that. It talks
right.
about
I've been getting
yeah,
that kind of inkling about it. Um, but also with Genesis, like when we're looking at that, one of my questions would be for try to ask this for some of our viewers who might have something like this in mind, where they're trying to say, well, how does this all fit into Genesis? Like
hmm
what like there were Gnostics that said that the world was created by angels, um, or the cosmos in Greek, in the Greek translations, was created by angels. Where do they get this crazy idea that the world is created by angels?
Well, if you look in Genesis 3, well, maybe just Genesis in general. I mean, there's one passage where it says, "Let us make man in our image."
Yeah,
Hence the term "our." No,
right.
and I discuss this on my blog on the Aeoni.
Yeah.
Yeah, in
And for
great
those of you
detail.
who don't know his blog, you can look right there, scroll down, and it's towards the bottom. It's the Aeon Eye. It's at WordPress.com. And you can check his blog out there. He's got a lot of good information, um, quite a few entries too. And you were doing, what was your recent post was actually about Genesis, wasn't it?
Yeah, I was talking about the kind of the Gnostic version of events as far as the Genesis myth and the creation myth, and how the Gnostics view the serpent. And going back to
Right.
the seven archons, I mean, you had you know Saturninus of Antioch who claimed that the world was created by angels or the seven angels. Um, then you also have Basilides, who was an Alexandrian Gnostic teacher, who basically said that the demiurge is what he called the demiurge is the seven. which might
Mhm.
have been kind of a reference to the seventh planet, Saturn.
And who called it that? Was that Saturninus?
Well,
Oh, Basilides.
Basilides,
Okay.
yeah, he called the demiurge a seven, but I think Saturninus, I don't think he really mentions that, but
And Basilides had the Great Archon, right? That was like the
right,
head of the seven.
yeah, you have Abraxas, you have a rooster-headed Roman soldier with snakes for legs, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
Um. Now, looking at Genesis 2, what's interesting too is that Genesis, the very beginning, it says in the beginning Elohim created the heavens and the earth. What is Elohim?
The Elohim is basically kind of a Hebrew term for gods, the gods. It's a
Yeah.
plural term.
Right.
Then that becomes kind of synonymous with the authorities.
And they try to say, oh, there's a majestic plural in it, but the majestic plural didn't even exist till the time of Diocletian, which is interesting. Around
Yeah,
282 or something AD.
yeah. It's just that the Orthodox kind of tend to explain a lot of these little anomalies in in the Old Testament way by saying, oh,
Right.
well, it's just it's just the one God, one God. They're kind of fixated on this idea of the one God, even though the Bible clearly says though it wasn't just one God.
Right. You were talking about Genesis 1:26 where it says, let us make man in our image,
Yeah.
in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting when they say in our likeness.
Uh-huh.
Well, in a lot of Gnostic texts, you have the demiurge, which is identified with the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, and
And
that's
then
where
you
you
have the head of, even in Genesis, the head of this group. I mean, the documentary hypothesis will say that, this text right here is the Yahwist account,
hmm
which is what you find in Genesis 2 verse 4. It's supposed to be a
hmm
Yahwist account, and before that you have the priestly source, which is based off the Elohist source supposedly, and the
hmm
Yahwist source is actually older, but it still uses the word Elohim. So it seems that the documentary hypothesis is actually severely wrong in this judgment that these texts were separate. It seems they were together, and it seems what it's saying is that it says, this is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created, when the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. So the Yahweh Elohim is what it's saying.
hmm
So Yahweh of the Elohim. So it seems to be saying that this guy's like the chief of this group, and he made the heavens and the earth with the Elohim.
hmm
Seems to be reciting it. And Yahweh is also a Phoenician god that's kind of equivalent to Yov, the god
hmm
of the hearth and things like that. And that seems to be one of his qualities, if you will. And also when you're getting into that too, like let's say the world was created by angels, like in the Canaanite myths, the Elohim are actually sons of God, or sons of El,
Right.
who is actually equated with Baal in several
hmm
in several of the texts. But when looking at this, what's your take on, or what might have been the Gnostics' take on say Genesis 3, where you have the serpent and Adam and Eve dealing with this Yahweh Elohim.
Well, the serpent in a lot of Gnostic texts is seen as a positive figure. You have, like we mentioned earlier, the hypostasis of the archons,
Right.
where you have the serpent is spoken as the instructor or 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 the teacher, I think it's like I think they call it the female principal that entered into the serpent.
That's funny that it's called the instructor.
Yeah, the instructor.
You know what's interesting about that is one of Clement of Alexandria's writings is called the instructor,
Hmm.
the
Interesting.
pedagogus. Yeah,
Okay. I didn't
it
know that.
just clicked in my head right now. It's like, wow, that's really, I didn't even know they called him that.
Yeah, the serpent is the instructor, and now in the origin of the world, the term. I mean, the serpent is also pretty much a positive figure. I mean, there's
Yeah,
other Gnostic.
that's an interesting writing too. Very third century, very philosophic.
Yeah, it's very. I think it's pretty Manichaean, kind of
Yeah,
Sethian Manichaean kind of
it has
writing.
a very heavy Manichaean. It probably is Manichaean.
Yeah, as far as the serpent goes, I mean, in the hypothesis of the archons, the serpent is sent by the pleroma, in essence, or it's kind of like the Sophia entered into the serpent to give wisdom through the fruits of
Right.
the tree of knowledge in order to awaken Adam and Eve from their forgetful ignorance. But of course, the figure of Eve is actually seen as kind of like an avatar Sophia. Like she's a luminous woman that awakens Adam, and he kind of arises from being in this kind of this uh, uh, kind of a worm creature, animalistic existence without a soul. He's just kind of like there without. It's kind of like a golem automaton. Someone's calling me.
All right.
But basic but but in essence, when Sophia or Eve awakens Adam and Adam calls Eve the mother of the living, the authorities kind of realize that
And what is Eve's name in Hebrew, by the way? Do you know?
that I do not know off the top of
It's
my head.
Hava.
Hava, okay,
Yeah, so that means mother of the living.
yeah, mother of the living,
Right.
on life, or like,
Which
and
is also an epithet for Inanna, by the way,
oh,
the ancient
well,
Sumerian goddess.
yeah, like yeah, it's a Greek term for. I mean, the Greeks called it Zoe, um,
Right.
but when authorities realize what Eve has done, uh, they kind of pursue her and try to and pretty much take advantage of her, not even like rape
Well,
her.
if Zoe was Zoe Deschanel, I'd pursue her and take advantage of her too.
Well, it's like you have Yaldabaoth. I mean, in the Apocryphon of John, he's like not exactly evil, but morally ambivalent in the sense that he recognizes the good or the heavenly realms above, and then he kind of, but then he instinctively wants that heavenly light, that divine light, and pursues it, and even attempts to rape it, and just kind of like clutch it, take it for himself, and kind of like do whatever he wants with it. I mean,
He
that's
wanted to get his freak on, apparently.
yeah, with the with the light, he wants to literally rape the light. I mean, it's kind of one of those themes that you see in a lot of Gnostic writing.
Right. He has this erotic fixation with light.
Yeah, yeah. Then he sees like this figure, you have the Anthropos or the Adamas, and then he looks in the chaotic abyss of or
I
the
don't think
primordial
Jesus would
waters.
be offended by him having an erotic fixation with light. I don't even think the Eastern Orthodox would have a problem with that. They talk about having an erotic love for God and all this stuff. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, they definitely do that. I mean, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of sexual symbolism in a lot of Gnostic writing.
Right.
I mean, overall erotic symbolism. But like
Yeah,
even
I
in
don't
Dungeon,
think Gnostics particularly had an extremely low view of sex, but I think they had a respect for preference, is what it seems like.
yeah, I think they were experts at using erotic
Yeah,
imagery, but
imagery, right.
at the same time they kind of like had a not. I mean, they didn't really. A lot of them didn't reject sex per se. Like the Valentinians
Yeah,
didn't really reject uh,
yeah. I
marriage
think
per
that was
se.
something up to individuals.
Yeah.
And it seems to me they got their erotic ideas on, or their use of erotic imagery from the Song of Songs by Solomon.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, you definitely see like in the paraphrase of Shem, for example. I mean, it defines a pleroma as like kind of this giant hymen, and the aeons are kind of like the pubes or something, and
Yeah.
then yeah, it's like it's really strange, and how there's like a demonic penis and how
Good thing.
unclean
Good
that
thing I put a
hymen. Yeah.
rating on this for nobody underage. Not like 14-year-olds don't know what sex is already anyway. The way our liberal education is, but yeah, I said it for
Oh,
just
for
in case. Oh, because I knew the topic of sex would come up with Gnosticism. It's inevitable. And
Well, I mean,
why, it's perfect that it would. It's funny because I don't even know how we even segued into that, but it makes sense because we're right where they're talking about Adam and Eve, which are the first people to have sex, apparently.
yeah, I mean, sexuality. I mean, you see, it just repeats in this whole thing of the archons and the Adam and Eve story. I mean, there's just so many different texts that talk about how the original sin was actually sex, and how the serpent was actually evil, and like according to like there's one text that in the Apocrypha of John, for example, it says like the serpent gave Adam and Eve sexual knowledge instead of just
Yeah,
simply,
right.
and how when through the sexual knowledge they transgressed and death entered into the world. So this theme of how the sexes became split because apparently the Adam and Eve were originally androgynous beings, and then when
It's interesting though. The idea of death entering into the world is interesting to me. Just thinking of that phrase after knowing enough about Gnostic cosmology, like when you look at that death entering into existence, um, is when Sophia has her abortion,
yeah
which is the demiurge, and basically the material creation was like just a placenta, basically.
yeah. Well, you had this grotesque mutant lion-headed snake
Yeah,
thing, So I mean, like some Gnostic groups kind of associate the serpent as being a malevolent creature, like in the Apocrypha of John. I mean, has I think it has a lot of Jewish influence, um, simply because they tend to negatively portray the serpent as kind of a demonic force. Um, and like in the Kabbalah, I mean that theme repeats again with Rabbi Isaac when he writes in the left emanation, or I'm sorry, the emanation of the treatise of the left emanation. I
that's
came
crazy
out.
that you just brought that up right
Yeah,
now because I was going to tell you, oh, we were talking about that earlier. You should bring that up.
yeah. It's just like I just remembered it right now. But
Yeah,
I mean, like he tends to equate the serpent with Samael, which is the fallen
right,
angel, the
right.
blind one, and of course in
Right, which is
also
funny because it's an incorrect, according to the Gnostics, that's an incorrect comparison. It's actually Yahweh that's Samael.
yes, yeah, Yahweh Samael. He's well,
Yeah.
and like over the years, I think like in
Or at
later,
least he's one of the Archons, In
yeah,
some systems, he's not directly um, Yahweh, but he's definitely Yaldabaoth. He's
hmm
definitely Saklos, which are all the same thing.
yeah, Saklas. I mean, like these different titles for this demiurgical satanic creator god.
Mhm.
Uh, I mean, like you have like Samael, of course, as we said earlier, was the blind one. Then Saklas is also a fool. So it's kind of interesting
Which
how,
reminds me of the tarot card.
yeah. It definitely reminds me of that. Like, what does the fool represent in the tarot? I mean,
I'd have to
yeah,
pull out my tarot instruction thing. I haven't done tarot for a while, but the
well,
Fool, I mean, obviously represents folly, for one thing.
yeah. I mean, you have the fool who kind of goes out in this adventure, uh,
Right.
but he
He
doesn't
doesn't
really
do things according to reason. He does things according
to his passions, I guess,
to his yeah to his
yeah,
desires or his passions.
desires.
Right.
And if interesting enough, the lion, in Plato, what does the lion represent? It represents the passion,
Right.
the irrational soul.
Right. So they're just trying to show he's the fool. He's a lion. They're the same thing. They both represent passions. He's not necessarily saying lions are fools, but he's trying to.
Yeah,
These authors are trying to convey this idea of rushing into desire and passion, and then what was he created out of? The Yaldabaoth was created out of Sophia's passion.
right, right. For
Right.
the tears of Sophia. I mean, Irenaeus kind of goes into kind of great detail how the matter, or at least the four elements, is basically comes from the grief of Sophia when she
Right.
falls from the pleroma.
And Irenaeus especially hated Gnostic groups, especially the Valentinians, because they had this view on when they would look at Genesis 3 or Revelation 12 or Ephesians 4, or they'd look at the Passion of Jesus. They'd look at the life of Jesus, the narrative about his life and him dying on the cross. They'd look at that as all kind of a series of parables or a series of things that had numerical things hidden in them, right? Where it was trying to convey this idea of this fall of Sophia from grace, this idea of matter splitting off and separating from the source of light, which is people call God, and just this falling into basically this what they called the deficiency, the kanoma.
Right.
What did they call the material existence besides the like what? How did they feel about it? Did they feel it was deficient, it was imperfect, it needed fulfilled, kind of like they feel about the law, kind of like what
Hmm.
Jesus says about the law, it needed fulfilled, it was in need of someone performing it and stuff like that. Um, what's the Gnostic view on material creation, and do they have that view because of the archons, because it was created by archons?
Well, the term kanoma is, of course, means emptiness,
Right.
and it's kind of interesting how in Buddhism they says emptiness is form and form is emptiness, which I'm pretty sure Gnostic would agree with, but
Oh yeah, I think they got that from
um,
Plato.
yeah, I think so too. Yeah,
I've always thought Buddhism is just Platonized Hinduism,
yeah, I think I pretty much nailed it right there. I think
just like
so
the
too.
Serapis cult is Platonized Egyptianism. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
In
yeah.
some degree, it still retains a lot of its heritage, though. It definitely still has a lot of Hindu ideas, which it may change in one way or another, but it's definitely a product of its environment.
Well, I think Hippolytus, a church father, he uses the term hysteremia. I think I'm not. I think I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but
Hysterema?
yeah, hysterema.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's it.
He uses that.
And
Uh,
actually, I think it's hysterema.
yeah, I think that
It
might be
might be
it.
Rama. I think that's how it's pronounced. I'd have to double check. I know I've heard the word before, though.
Yeah, I think it's Marcus Magician, I believe, who uses the term the demiurge. He equates the demiurge with the hysterema, but
Hmm.
I think that this use hysterema is kind of like it complements a pleroma in a way, which is kind of very platonic in a sense because you have the upper world of light, which are or the true forms, then you have
Hmm.
the material world, and it's separated by a veil, which is called the horos.
Right, the intermediate state, and
Yeah,
it's called various different things. It's called the veil.
yeah, the cross, the
It's even
cross.
represented when Jesus, like to the Gnostics, when Jesus, I think it's when the woman comes up and grabs the hem of Jesus's garment,
Hmm.
was supposed to represent the veil, and then the veil in the temple being pulled away and things like that. They Gnostics saw some kind of hint or expression of that in those passages, I think.
Yeah, the gospel. Yeah, you have Jesus kind of going into the temple trying to get rid of all the money changers, which the
Right,
Gnostic would interpret that as the logos entering in the material world,
right.
uh, and he's trying to get rid of kind of fighting the powers and
The robbers and the
the robbers,
thieves
the authorities, and the authorities. Yeah,
and the rapists, basically.
yeah, yeah. You have that theme all over. I mean, the Bible, especially the New Testament, was very much allegorized by the Gnostics. I mean, they didn't take the Old and New Testament firsthand. Like it's just simply you know there's only one way of looking at it as literal, but they didn't do that at all. They kind of saw
Right,
there's different layers of meaning, and Valentinus is pretty much an expert at that.
right. They had like this idea that there was a a pneumatic way of interpreting it, a psychic way, and a like a hylic way. But then they also had the idea of there being things hidden in the text through numerological ways, not numerology, but numerological ways. Like there was gematria. There's another thing too that has to do with gematria that comes with numbers. I forget exactly what it's called though. I'd have to look it up. Um, but there was two numerical forms of sorting out passages, and there were multiple things hidden in like Genesis, like with Genesis 3. Or I think it was Genesis 3, but yeah, where the rib is removed from Adam.
Hmm.
Like the Nahashi Gnostics I was just reading earlier from Hippolytus in his fifth book of the Philosophemena. he talks about I think it's like in the first couple chapters. He's talking about how the Nahashin or Nahasheni Gnostics they saw um, basically. I'm trying to think of how it was. They saw that there was Adam and there was the Son of Man, the Son of Adam.
Right.
So Jesus is got the Son of Adam in him, and this Adam is the primal Adam, which is not even really proper to call him primal Adam because he's the Adam Kadmon of Kabbalah, basically.
Yeah.
And he basically, in a sense, the universe of light to some degree, or he's all the aeons or something, and that was in Jesus, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's kind of this idea that, well, Adam is the pleroma in Genesis 3, and Eve is the kenoma, and she was taken from Adam. So they kind of had that like that kind of meaning was conveyed by looking at it as a parable. So they kind of thought Moses had hidden this science, this gnosis, in this myth.
Right.
Like he didn't really believe, oh, all people came from Adam and Eve, you know. Um, and so yeah, he wasn't taking it literally. I mean, there are obviously places where things are meant to be taken for what they say, as in literally.
Right.
And people like to misuse that term a lot, but there are places where it doesn't make sense to take things literally. I think Origen was keen to that idea, but like Philo of Alexandria, I went on a Philo reading binge one day, and I must have been reading Philo for like 7 hours straight, and I got because everyone talks really highly of Philo. You know, I was like, okay, I'm gonna look into Philo, and I found a lot of problems with Philo that just don't meld right with, you know, uh, Josephus or, you know, Gnostics or the Talmud and things like the things I had read before. He had a lot of unique ideas that definitely weren't taught to him. That really came from his own head. So he's very interesting in that sense. But Origen kind of does the same thing. Yet Origen seems to be this contrarian that kind of contradicts himself. He a lot of places, and he's only making his arguments because he's constructing an argument to defend his position, whatever the hell his position really is. It's hard to tell. But then again, you have the Orthodox really sanitize his writings and didn't preserve a lot of them.
Right.
You know, so you have that problem.
And,
but with the serpent, before we move on, I want to ask you, where, you know, as far as you can tell, like in at least in the Catholic or Orthodox Christian tradition, when did the serpent get vilified? When did he become this evil creature, and why was he evil? And are there texts where Adam couldn't stand upright? I mean, they have that, right? And then they have stuff where the serpent bred with Eve and gave birth to Cain. You know, there's different things like that. What's your take on those things?
Well, as far as I can tell, I think the Orthodox exegesis on the serpent kind of begins with Irenaeus. I mean, he basically he says that you know, I think let me pull it up right now.
But is it in the New Testament? Is where I would want to start. Do you find any sentiment of that in the New Testament that the serpent
is evil?
Evil? He is Satan? He is this evil demonic figure?
The only place that I can find that specifically equates the devil with the serpent is the Book of Revelation.
Right.
Now, the book of Revelation, of course, it might have started off as a Gnostic document, but over the time it became this whole other monster that resembles nothing like Gnosticism. I mean, it's just,
and that serpent idea fits in perfectly fine with, I think, wasn't it the tripartite tractate? Was that the one we were talking about? That is full of this original sin nonsense. Yeah. So.
Well, Irenaeus, he says in Against Heresies, but that God was true and the serpent a liar was proved by the result, death having passed upon them who had eaten. For along with the fruit, they did not also fall under the power of death, because they did eat in disobedience, and the disobedience to God entails death. Wherefore, as they became forfeit to death, from that moment they were handed over to it. But when you actually read Genesis, it doesn't say that they actually died. I mean, the serpent.
Right, and Augustine, I want to add something there before we move on. Augustine, he said they contracted death.
Yeah.
And he said that this death was painfully penal, meaning it was a penalty for their transgression, their disobedience. That you can find that in, oddly enough, Book 13 to show his superstition. It's Book 13 of his City of God. He goes over that.
Yeah, I mean, like the serpent, well, never says that. I mean, you're going to die. I mean, it simply says that they knew their eyes would be open, knowing good and evil.
Right. So.
Even though God basically says that you're going to die if you eat the fruit, but they didn't die. In fact, it was the opposite. They gained knowledge of the true predicament. So who's a liar here? Is it the serpent or God, or this being called the Lord God?
Right.
So and Irenaeus has this tendency to kind of use his own prejudices to read the Bible in this way. I mean, he even talks about how like Paul's letter, I mean, to the Corinthians, he says that the flesh and blood kind of inherit the kingdom of God, but he then interprets that to mean that, well, the flesh does in fact inherit the kingdom of God. So it's just kind of he tends to kind of invert the meanings a lot.
Genesis is interesting too. I mean, Genesis 1 through 3 is probably the most interesting part of the entire Bible, in my opinion. It's freaking ridiculous how much is written on these 3 chapters.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think there's more commentary written on these than anything else in history. But when you're looking at this, you have this idea in Genesis 2:9 where it says, Yahweh Elohim, or Lord God, made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground. These trees were pleasing to the eye and good for food. They were pleasing to the eye and good for all the trees. That's what it says right there. And it says, in the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. This gets turned into the knowledge of good and evil, but it seems to originally have just said good tree of knowledge, because in other texts, whenever they talk about it, they just call it the tree of knowledge.
Mm.
But it's interesting that it says here that all the trees that he planted were pleasing to the eye and good for food. And then it says Eve saw that they were pleasing to the eye and good for food. So it doesn't make any sense how they could all be good for food, and then he goes and tells them, no, you can't eat this.
Right. Yeah, that and especially what's really interesting of that story is after they eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge, God forbids them from eating the tree of life.
Right.
So which means like, okay, so
in other words, he's saying, oh, you can this is good to eat, but you can't eat it. And then they eat it, and he goes, well, see, it's because it was crap in the first place. That's why I told you not to eat it. So now you can't eat the good stuff.
Yeah, like, he's basically like he's living in fear. Like this guy like is very fearful of Adam and Eve eating this fruit of life, the tree of life.
And you know what's crazy with this is, according to the documentary hypothesis, this is where it really gets wild. The section Genesis 2:15 through 2:18 is actually priestly source, so it's not original.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the crazy thing.
So it's added pretty much later. Yeah, there's also a theory that Genesis.
Right, like 200 years later.
It was added later. Yeah.
Like 722 BC or something. The other one's 900 something during the reign of Solomon or something.
Yeah, it's like apparently Genesis 2 is actually the original creation myth, and Genesis 1 was actually added later. So,
right.
I mean, there's a lot of...
And so was this right here, where it says, Lord God took the man and put him in the garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. And the Lord God commanded the man, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So in other words, in the original text, it didn't say they weren't free to eat from it. It said they were good and pleasing, and probably didn't even have them getting kicked out. You even have 2:21 through 23 is priestly source too.
Mm-hmm.
I just realized that looking at it right now, because I have it highlighted.
Right
That's
here. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
I did never clicked in my head until right now. That's weird.
Huh. Interesting.
I'm having synapses firing off in my brain right now.
Well, it's because of our lively Gnostic discussion.
Right, that's why I like discussions like this. It gets me thinking more.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're looking at that, you've got him basically saying you're free to eat from any tree. And then he's like, but you can't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. For when you eat it, you will surely die. And then the serpent comes along and he says, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? The woman, Eve, she goes, we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God said you must not eat from the tree. It's in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it or you will die. Well, what's interesting is that Eve says, he said you must not touch it. He never said that.
Right.
So Eve is like bullshitting right here, but maybe he originally did say not to touch it. Maybe the text got changed, but he did say if you ate it, you will die. Now, the problem is that, see, Orthodox Christians have kind of this mental gymnastic thing going on, this cognitive problem where they think it's possible to die an everlasting death. And they think that when he's saying death, he's saying you'll contract death. He never said you would contract mortality. They don't use that word, and even in Hebrew, it doesn't mean mortality. It's saying you will die. In other words, it's like saying that if I inject myself with an oxygen bubble, I'll die, or if I drink poison, I'll die, or if I crash my car at 100 miles an hour into a pole, I'll die. Like he's literally saying, like, eat it and you're gonna fucking die because it's poison. It's a poison apple.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then she eats it and finds out it's not poison. The serpent told her, no, it's not poison. It's cool. I eat them all the time.
Right.
He's like, it tastes bomb. You know what I mean? It's kind of like reefer madness telling you, oh no, don't smoke weed, man. You'll go crazy and kill everyone, kill yourself.
Right.
This was basically the first reefer madness ever written. I mean, these could have been Amanita muscaria, like people say too. But the thing is, it's like this is the original reefer madness. It's this imposing government figure going around in this paradise, and he's like, well, man, you can't eat that, okay? Because that's against the law. You can't fucking do that,
Right.
and the death penalty. You're gonna get the death penalty for that.
Yeah.
If I catch you doing this drug. And the serpent's like, nah, man, I do this shit every day. It's bomb, and he ain't gonna know about it. It's cool. And then she takes it. She's like, whoa, man, I can see, and she's good. So I mean, there's parallels there that are pretty funny too.
Yeah, it kind of highlights this very legislative nature of this being called the Lord God in Genesis. And of course, in the Old Testament, he's called the lawgiver. So he's always
Or as the Jews call it, bereshit.
Bereshit, yeah.
Which always sound like bear shit to me.
Bereshit.
Maybe he's the bear or the bear archon.
Yeah, that's like that possibly. Possibly. I mean,
only using our Jordan Maxwell etymologies could we come up with that. Because the sun is the sun, and
Well, the
Winnie the Pooh was a smiling turd. He is like Mr.
the fruit of knowledge might have been some kind of.
He's like Mr. Hanky.
Yeah, so some kind of psychedelic mushroom. That's why Adam and Eve were like, wow,
right.
dude.
Wow, dude, I'm not dying. I'm high. I'm dying of munchies.
Like no, the serpent didn't give me the mushroom. The serpent didn't give me. No,
God comes there. He's like, oh my God, they actually ate the tree too. They were so hungry.
It was Eve's fault. Eve gave me the reefer. No, right? No. It was a serpent.
So then it says that she saw that it was good for food, is pleasing to the eye, just like he said, right? Or just like Moses says, and and then she says, and also desirable for gaining wisdom. Apparently, right then she had gained wisdom because they realized they were naked.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't appear that God is lying here. It appears that the serpent's telling the truth. Or I mean, it doesn't appear that God's telling the truth here and the serpent's lying. It appears that God's lying and the serpent's telling the truth.
Yeah, so it's kind of like when you actually read that.
Right, and it never says God in it. It says Elohim.
Yeah.
It directly equates him with Elohim.
Or it says, yeah, Elohim or the Lord God. Hence the term Lord. Lord. What is a Lord? Lord is a governor. Lord is a ruler. Lord is
Well,
master.
that's how they interpret Yahweh, though.
Yeah. Right.
Yahweh becomes Lord. Originally, it says Yahweh Elohim,
Mm-hmm.
saying Yahweh, the name of one of the Elohim, the one of the sons of God.
Right. There's, I think, like, in a matter of fact, like the
Which is
serpent.
probably why they couldn't decide if he was Sabaoth or Yaldabaoth. It makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yaldabaoth could just be El.
Yeah. Um,
And these could be his 7 sons.
well, in essence, the author of Genesis doesn't say they both died. It just simply says that the eyes of Adam and Eve were open. So
Right,
both,
so they didn't die, so he was lying.
yeah. Yeah, so, like the serpent said, so the creator, basically complained to his very mysterious companions.
Right,
Like,
and then he
and
threw a
now,
temper tantrum and cursed
yeah.
them.
Yeah, and now man has become as one of us to know good and evil.
Yeah.
So the creator God is the one who lied.
And so now
And,
man's learned how to be a liar.
yeah.
So essentially he taught man how to lie.
And instead, like, the serpent was telling truth, and in a matter of fact, the creator himself actually ended up agreeing with the serpent. That's the whole irony of the whole
And
story.
then you can tell this isn't the Gnostic concept of God or even the Christian concept of God, because this guy doesn't even know where they're at. He's like, hey, where are you?
Yeah.
And he's trying to find him. He's walking around the garden. And Yahweh in the Old Testament, especially in Genesis, is actually known to be like a man. He walks
Mm-hmm.
around like a man. He wrestles. He does. He
Jacob.
sits and he has tea and crumpets with Abraham,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
like a
yeah.
regular British prime minister.
Just like this regular, really powerful Zeus-like god,
Mm-hmm.
Kind of Jupiter deity. I mean, like,
Yeah, he's a son of Jove.
yeah, Jove.
Yeah, just like the same way, like the sons of Jupiter.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's just really funny, and it's kind of funny how a lot of the
That's why Justin Martyr goes, well, there's no difference between what you say about sons of Jupiter.
yeah. Well, it's kind of funny, like how the different archons can be equated to different planets. Like the Elder can be equated with Saturn,
Right.
and at the same time, Sabaoth is equated with Jehovah or Yahweh, but of course, Yahweh, and of course, what is Jupiter? Jupiter is Zeus. Jupiter is
Right.
the son of Saturn or Kronos.
Right.
So you have almost like Sabaoth kind of rebelling against his father.
And Jupiter is also Deus Pater, which is God the Father.
Yeah, so you
Yeah.
have all these different kind of connections between these different Greek gods and
Right.
the Jewish gods. I mean, like the Jews. I mean, there was more than one God in Judaism. I mean, it's they clearly believe that it's not just monotheism. Monotheism wasn't just the only theology.
Hey, and then this God was so like lame that he couldn't even give Eve a name. Adam had to do it. Once he received the knowledge, he ends up naming his own wife.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
The mother of the living, not of the dead.
The living.
Yeah, not of the dead. She
Yeah.
gave birth to things that were living. Um, the whole idea that you can contract death is probably one of the funniest ideas in history. It's okay. The idea of contracting death is about as comical as contracting or as dying in eternal death, like dying over and over. Like it doesn't logically make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't think of what exactly could be as stupid to say as that. But those are probably the two stupidest things I've ever heard in my life. And okay. Oh no, I got one that's as stupid as that. Saying Jesus is the Son of God, but he's God.
Right.
He's the Son and the Father. How can you give birth to yourself and be the Son and the Father?
Yeah, a lot of Protestant Christians kind of
right. They're Sabellians. That's what they are.
They kind of confuse a lot of terminology. I mean, like for example, like the idea of destruction. What is destruction in Christianity? I mean, they say, well, destruction means everlasting hellfire. But when you actually kind of dig through what the meaning behind that, destruction has nothing to do with eternal
I mean, I can understand having a fire that burned for a long time.
Right.
I can get that provided it had enough thing to burn. I can get the idea of the fire being everlasting because so many people are going to hell. Like I get that, but I can't get the idea that these people stay alive in hell on fire. That doesn't make any sense to me. Like when do they die? Oh, they never die. They have to be in eternal. Like what the fuck?
Yeah, well, what's really being said through all this is actually matter. Actually, there's an end for matter. That
Right.
that that matter will end in a fiery inferno, and that
Right.
after that, a new kingdom will be born from that. But the new kingdom has already existed for eternity. And that kingdom is, the pleroma or the fullness.
Right. Everything will be restored. What they call the restoration or the
Yeah,
apokatasis.
either the material world will basically be completely destroyed, or
Right.
or the light from the cosmos will be extracted, and the
Which
cosmos
is
will
the
be
final
extracted.
result of completing the redemption of Sophia,
Yeah.
the redemption of wisdom, the redemption of essentially people being brought to gnosis.
Mhm.
And Paul talks about the mystery of Sophia and things like that, and talks about imparting it verbally, by voice and things like that in his letters. And then what's interesting too is in Ephesians, and I've got it on the sidebar over there. There's a thing for Ephesians 4. Um, but hidden in Ephesians 4, like I was saying with Genesis 3 and Revelation 12, and I've got one on Revelation 12 there too. But I'm trying to remember what passage. I think it's 4:13.
Yeah, I don't remember the
Yeah,
passage
here it is. It's
offhand.
4:13. It says, "Until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining the whole measure of the fullness of Christ." The word fullness is pleroma, the
Mhm.
pleroma of the Christ. When it's talking about this, it actually all numerically through gematria, all the aeons are actually listed right here in that one passage,
Mhm.
which is one of the craziest things I've ever found in the whole
Hmm.
entire Bible is that.
Interesting.
And some guy did the research on it. I found his research online. I was looking through it, and I added up stuff, looked up the Hebrew words and some of the Greek words and stuff, and I was looking at it, I was like, it's actually stunningly accurate. I haven't got to finish going through the whole thing, but I would like to. And it seems
Mhm.
that he's right. It seems that this is why Ephesians was so important to the Valentinians, and the Valentinians were using this um, because this contains the idea that kind of this the idea that Ephesians has on what the church is, the way it defines the church, and the way it defines Christ, and the way it shows their relation to one another, is unique to Ephesians. And it's something that the early church fathers don't take up. They don't have any care for it at all. Irenaeus doesn't mention it. Justin doesn't care about it. Hippolytus has no idea about it. Tertullian doesn't give two shits about it.
Right. Now, my question to you, James. Now, how does the archons, like I think we discussed earlier, how do the archons fit into the orthodoxy and the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church? And what's going on with with the Pope and all this kind of stuff. I mean, how do the archons kind of fit to this whole scheme of things as far as the Catholic Church goes?
Well, in terms of the popes, I mean, the pope is just a bishop in
Mm-hmm.
reality. All his inflated views of himself or themselves, various popes that they've had, the several hundred or whatever they've had, um, they're views that really popped up about 432 AD or so. They started taking shape really around 380 AD,
Mm-hmm.
and around 432 they had kind of become full blown into this idea that the Pope is the head of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And that was gradually kind of popping up in little ways in terms of people rendering their obedience. And what was happening in the third century, in the mid third century, you had people in Alexandria. Whenever they had a dispute with Antioch, because it was mainly between Antioch and Alexandria needed some backing, they would go to Rome because Rome and Carthage were buddy buddy, and so was Corinth, and these places were major players. They were united, and Alexandria said, "Well, I'm going to side with the majority over Antioch." And Antioch's where all the Arian views came from, and Origen essentially ended up in Palestine and Antioch and stuff, and so his views took on a lot of weight there. And Origen was a big pivotal thing in the Arian disputes of the 4th century. But when they were forming, this Orthodox political imperial
Right.
church.
Right.
But what was happening in the 3rd century is Alexandria was rendering its obedience to Rome in order to defeat its enemies in Antioch, which
Mhm.
now you still see in Syria. There's infighting in the church there where these bishops still practice the age-old ritual of killing each other, which was actually an Orthodox practice of the 3rd and 4th century. Um, they maimed each other and stabbed each other at the Council of Nicaea, even in some of the synods. So this idea of the Pope being in charge, it's because in the 3rd century the Pope started getting this inflated view because Alexandria would go to them in order to get rescued. But at the same time, Alexandria had a Pope.
Mhm.
They went by the same title. And so that was a common title for bishops,
Mhm.
especially in the West.
Right.
And so they were starting to gain this idea. And by 380 AD, they were editing Irenaeus's writings to be pro-papal. And Catholics still use those writings to this day like that. And then they were basically, by about 432 AD, you had, I think it was Pope Pius III, who's declaring that, he's the head of the church. End of story. Let's cut the bullshit. And this is after the sack of Rome, by the way, which was in 410 AD. And this was not too, it's not too far from the death of Augustine. And
Mhm.
Augustine was formulating these original sin views based on things like the tripartite tractate and stuff like that. And the ideas that Caiaphas had on sin and atonement. And so really it's kind of like this Sadducean leaven that kind of seeped into the papacy. And by I think it was like the 18th century, they're declaring papal infallibility and speaking ex cathedra is so important and all this stuff. So really, um, but at the time, not even just with the papacy, with bishops like Ambrose, Athanasius, and stuff like that. Athanasius is the one who pushed for the inclusion of the Book of Revelation and pushed for its interpretation and all these things. And Augustine followed it. But basically, you had bishops who were very, very central and very important, especially Ambrose. Ambrose was probably one of the biggest players in the 4th century, and probably one of the biggest players just in the first 5 or 6 centuries, even. And
Mhm.
he had the emperor under his thumb. He could tell the emperor what to do, Theodosius the First, and essentially it led to banning paganism and other things, simply because he said so. He basically he was like Theodosius was like George Bush,
Mhm.
and Ambrose was like Dick Cheney. He was the man behind the scenes. He was the puppet master pulling the strings.
Right.
And Theodosius was an idiot, basically. And so he comes up with these decrees. He bans Gnosticism, destroys temples, and he basically has this Christian mob police force, kind of like the Parabolani that were under Cyril in the 5th century in Alexandria. He has these people running around destroying Valentinian temples and calling them Jews or pagans or whatever so he could ban them. And Cyril's probably the next guy that's the big player. It's probably Ambrose, Augustine, and Cyril were the big evil, crazy bishops, and they're a perfect example of yeah, the psychos.
Yeah, it's like
They're the perfect example of archons. Those guys are archons. If you really want to know what archons are, read about those people. Um, but even earlier, though, when it comes to authorities, essentially the Satan or the adversary was Julius Caesar himself. He was the son of Venus, is what he called himself. Um, Venus was equated with Lucifer, and so it was seen that like Julius Caesar was Satan. He's the ultimate enemy of these people. Um, and so you see in the 4th century, the Roman Church adopts the idea like we have the Curia now, right, and the Magisterium. Well, that
Mhm.
idea is adopted from the College of Pontiffs, which was the headed by the Roman Emperor, who was the Pontifex Maximus. A la Constantine. Constantine was the Pontifex Maximus. So you have that, and that's really the governing body of these archons on Earth. Is these people, and there's very negative views of them expressed among the Gnostics. And I mean, you find it in the Gospel of Judas. I have it right here, and I know we went over this last time, so I had it ready just in case.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it says here that this is, Judas and Jesus talking, but it's also the apostles talking to, or his disciples talking to him. And it says, another day Jesus came up to them, and they said to him, Master, we have seen you in a vision, for we have had great dreams during this night that has passed. And Jesus said, why have you blank, there's text missing, and gone into hiding? So why have you got scared and gone into hiding? Who knows what it actually said, but he's asking him essentially, why have you gone into hiding? And so they said to him, his disciples, we've seen a great house with a large altar in it. Now keep in mind, great house is actually in Egyptian, Pharaoh.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what the Pharaoh's name was, the Great House. So that's an interesting thing too. A Pharaoh is an archon who thinks he's the son of God, like Julius Caesar thinks he's the son of Venus. And it says, so we've seen a great house with a large altar in it, and there's 12 men, and they are the priests. We would say they said, well, they looked like priests. Notice they all had this vision in their dream. You see, for we have had great dreams during this night. So all these visions were coming to them in dreams. They weren't, extrasensory hallucinations while they're awake. They were having these in their dreams, and they all had the same dream. This is what tripped them out. They're like, wow, we all had the same dream. We woke up, we talked about it, and like, what the fuck is this? We saw priests at an altar in a great house, like what? Like St. Peter's, a great cathedral. And then it says here, and a name blank. We don't know what's there, but it's probably, and a name was inscribed on the altar, which was a common practice. You see even INRI is inscribed on crosses, and the cross is above the altar in a Catholic church. And it says a crowd of people is waiting at that altar until the priest finished presenting the offerings. We also kept waiting. And what's the offering? The offering is the Eucharist ceremony, the Mass. So this is a Catholic Mass. It's very much describing a Catholic Mass. And it said Jesus says to them, what are blank like? So it could be he's saying, what are the priests like, or what are the people like? It's probably what's everyone at the gathering like, in a sense, because they follow up by saying, and the apostles said, some blank for 2 weeks, probably fasting,
right?
Which is a practice where they'll fast for 2 weeks at given times of the year. I think that's what, at Lent, don't they do that?
Yeah, yeah.
It says others sacrifice their own children. Now, keep in mind, sacrifice in the Old Testament, in several passages, in old documents, any documents that are ancient, sacrifice doesn't imply murder or ritual murder or killing. Sacrifice could mean to give something. It just means to give something up. So it should say here they give up their children. Others, their wives. So Marcion and the Marcionites were known for giving up their wives. In praise and in humility with each other. Others sleep with men. You see, this practice was a problem. Actually, they had pederasty, but this is saying specifically they sleep with men, adult men. Male prostitution was another problem in the early church as well. Then it says others are involved in slaughter. At the time, it probably wasn't uncommon for some of these groups to practice the Passover with the lamb still. So it could have been that, but it could mean in slaughter. It doesn't necessarily mean they had to be slaughtering someone while they were there. It could be possibly taken to mean that they attack each other. It's hard to tell. And it says, still others commit a multitude of sins and deeds of lawlessness. We know that in the late 2nd century there was a big scandal in the church with Zephyrinus and Calixtus and other people, and even Victor, over admitting sinful pagans into the church. There's a surge of pagan converts. And it says, and the men who stand before the altar invoke your name. So the priests invoke the name of Jesus. So that's important. And then you have other texts in the Nag Hammadi where they said, I think it's the second treatise of the Great Seth, I think it was. Is that the one where they talk about Hermas or Hermes? Hermas. Yeah, they say
Hermas,
the
yeah,
name
yeah.
of a dead man, Hermas, and that text was around at that time. So that gives us a hint as to when that was written, which is after the time of Pope Pius, in the time of Irenaeus, likely. And so this very much follows that polemic pattern, and that's the other one I want to bring up for polemics. So you should pull that up real quick and see if you can, type F3 and fast search and see if Hermas is in there, because I'm pretty sure they talk about that. And then it says, and while they are involved in all the deeds of their sacrifice, the altar is filled. The sacrifice is the Eucharist. After they said this, they were quiet, for they were troubled. And then Jesus said to them, "Why are you troubled? Truly I say to you, all the priests who stand before that altar invoke my name. And again I say to you, my name has been written on blank of the generations of the stars by the human generations." We don't know what he said right there. "And they have planted trees without fruit in my name in a shameful manner." Now the trees and the fruit in Luke is talking about the what people would call, like maybe Jimi Hendrix might have called it, the color of the heart, but it basically their true inner outlook on life is the heart, and so they're whether they're good or bad, and the fruit is the words that come out of their mouth, just like Jesus was saying, what comes out of your mouth damns you. And so they've planted trees without fruit, but the trees are also the people, you see, because it's their heart, it's their inner being, like your spirit.
Right.
That's kind of like what your heart is. So the words that are coming out of their mouth, they have no fruit. In other words, anything that comes out of their mouth is just chatter. It's chitter chatter. Bullshit. It's basically what he's saying. So they stand up there and they speak bullshit in my name. It's directly what he's saying, if you want to put it in English.
Well, let's look what the second treatise of the Great Seth says.
Right.
It says, "After we went forth from our home and came down into this world, and came into being in the world in bodies, we were hated and persecuted, not only by those who are ignorant, but also by those who think that they are advancing the name of Christ, since they are unknowingly empty and not knowing who they are, like dumb animals." So you have this theme of kind of like the Gnostics, kind of like writing a very kind of polemic.
Is the Hermas thing in there?
The Hermas? I don't think so. I mean, I put in find and I couldn't.
How did you spell it?
I put Hermas.
Try Hermes.
Hermes? Okay. Yeah, it doesn't show up.
Okay, try the 3 Stells of Seth. It might be in there.
Okay. Yeah, that one's a kind of a liturgy kind of thing going on there.
I don't remember which one it is. There's one where they say Hermas. Maybe it was the Testimony of Truth. Yeah, I thought it was a more Basilidian type writing, but let's see. I'll fast search it right here, see if anything comes up. Yeah, I have a few things ready on my computer that we can talk about too. Yeah, it's not here, but they talk about in the name of a dead man, Hermas, the firstborn of something, I don't know, some weird crap. It's really not in there, huh? I don't remember. I could have sworn it was the second treatise of the Great Seth.
Yeah, it's not. I can't seem to find it.
Maybe it was the Apocalypse of Peter.
Maybe. Let's see.
That's probably it, because it's either that or second treatise on the Great Seth. Those are the two that talk about like Simon of Cyrene and type stuff like that, right?
Yeah. Treatise of Seth does mention that. Let's see. Hermas, yeah.
Okay, thank God for Lumosity. it's sharpening my memory skills. Yeah, brain power. I didn't score 1,200 points today for nothing.
Awesome. Yeah, it says, let's see. "For they shall come out of them, and my forgiveness of their transgressions, into which they fell through their adversaries, whose ransom I got from the slavery in which they were, to give them freedom, that they may create an imitation remnant in the name of a dead man, who is Hermas.
There you go.
Of the firstborn of unrighteousness, in order that the light may exist, which exists may not be believed by the little ones."
Okay, so there you go. The little ones are the children of light. They created a imitation remnant, so that's important terminology there. Well, what happened actually, Pius doesn't come too long after Hyginus. And Hyginus is the one who was the first pope that was elected.
Right.
When Hyginus was elected, and Pius is tied to Hermas, and so there's this idea of having connection problems, but there's this idea of Hermas, the firstborn of unrighteousness. Well, a lot of people, kind of Valentinians and other Gnostics, kind of saw the church from Hyginus onward as the church of Hermas.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when that writing was being used. And Irenaeus loves that writing in the sense that a lot of his ideas are central to that writing. He only quotes it one time and calls it scripture. But a lot of ideas from that are in his writings, and the writing's chock full of pagan nonsense.
Right.
So that's probably where that's coming from. And but Jesus interprets this to them, and he tells them, "It's you who are presenting the offerings."
Mm-hmm.
By you, he means the 12 disciples, or at least 11 of them anyway. He goes, "You guys, you're the ones presenting the offerings on the altar that you've seen. That one is the God you serve."
Mm-hmm.
And you are the 12 men you've seen, and the cattle that are brought in are the sacrifices you have seen. That is the many people you've led astray. So they're cattle. It's kind of like these people are vampire charlatans that leech off of these people. You see what I mean? Like that's their cattle, you know. And how do they leech off them? And what's the blood that they suck out of them? Their money. Notice in Acts, Peter's like, "Give me your money or you'll perish," right? So there you have them covering up the fact that Peter probably murdered someone because they wouldn't give to the donation box.
Right.
And says, "That's the many people you've led astray before that altar. And the blah, 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 blank will stand up and make use of my name in this way." So the priests probably will stand up and make use of my name. And the generations of the pious will be loyal to him. So the generations of the pious will be loyal to him is talking about the Pope or the bishop. And you have Ignatius not too long before that, talking about the bishops being the head of the church. Now, Irenaeus quotes Ignatius's letter to the Romans, which is the earliest evidence of any of the Ignatian letters is Romans. And actually, the letter to the Romans has a separate transmission history from the other letters. So it's most likely that that's probably the only actual authentic letter that's possible. But if not, if there really was a collection of them, which he also uses Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, and I think that mentions the letters of Ignatius. So it's possible that the 7 that they say are authentic are. And that would be even more beneficial to my case, when looking at that, because you've got 7 letters, and they're all talking about this bishop primacy and we're above prophets and this and that. And so, in other words, the bishop is the false prophet. And so you've got Paul and this other group of people calling each other back, these Judaizers calling each other back and forth false prophets or pseudo. He calls them false apostles, and they call him a false prophet.
Right.
Right? And so, but here's what it says, and this is where it gets even more interesting. After him, another man will stand up from the fornicators. Well, that's exactly what the bishops of Rome were accused of, was fornication. In the late 3rd century, or the late 2nd century, early 3rd century, Hippolytus and Tertullian are accusing them of being fornicators. And it says, and another will stand, and these are the same people who are teaching that Jesus is God the Father. Keep that in mind. And another will stand up from the slayers of children, and they don't really mean slaying their children, they mean sacrificing their children to the church. And another from those who sleep with men and those who abstain, and the rest of the people of pollution, lawlessness, and angels, what Paul's against, right? They are the stars that bring everything to completion. So here's this idea, the stars, maybe they're like kind of like the angels are the subordinate, they're the sub-archons in a sense, Then you have the idea that people are called archbishop. And then you have in ancient Greece, archon basileus, which is like, basilica is got the same root word as Basilius. Right. And so you have this leader of this, great house or whatever. It's kind of like the same idea. And then it says, "For to the human generations it has been said, look, God has received your sacrifice from the hands of priests." Um, that is a minister of error. In other words, this guy purposely leads them into error. But the Lord who commands is he who is the Lord of the cosmos. On the last day they will be put to shame. So that's what he says. He tells them to stop sacrificing and all
Mm-hmm.
this other stuff, and it kind of cuts out right there, and that's really where he ends it. And he accuses them of struggling with him.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all we have from the Gospel of Judas for that, but that's definitely anti-orthodox polemic.
Yeah, I think the main message, besides the whole, I mean, there's a whole big argument about whether Judas was a good guy or a bad guy, but besides
Right.
that, um, I
I
think
don't
the
think that's
main,
really important whether he was or
yeah,
not.
I think the main message of the Gospel of Judas is actually, it's basically saying that Orthodox
The
Christians
Gospel of
worship.
Judas is strange though, because it doesn't seem to paint Judas as a good guy at all. It seems to deride him and paint him actually as a bad guy. It kind of actually agrees with the parts where he's called Satan in the Gospel of John,
Well, it's interesting
and it seems
because
to make him the demiurge in a lot of ways too.
yeah, he's kind of like an agent of the Elderbeoth. I think there's a lot of
Yeah.
people like I think it's April Deconic. She claims that Judas is an agent of Satan or whatever.
All right.
But
I think Judas is seen as in a good light by Papias.
hmm
And what Papias of Hierapolis says essentially is that Judas was martyred by a Roman chariot. He was run over, presumably, probably in the first Jewish-Roman War,
hmm
because he
well,
was
I
a
think
zealot
hmm
or a Sicarii, according to Eisenman. But
but I think the basic message of the Gospel of Judas is basically saying that the Orthodox Christians actually worship Satan or the demiurge.
right, that
The
seems to be the central message: is that they worship uh, a false concept of God, and they worship the sun, which obviously can't speak or talk. It's like a dumb idol,
right.
and they worship the spirit that it inspires in them, and they worship a dead man. Presumably Hermas had already been dead at that time, and they worshipped his ideas on God. Is basically what they're worshiping, and they
hmm
call it Jesus, and they worship his dead body. Um, which Jesus, like any other man, his body decayed and was eaten by worms, like anybody else. It didn't transform and fly away and go into heaven and all this weird stuff.
Right. Which it kind of goes to the whole idea that if Jesus taught that Christianity and the world were mutually exclusive, and the form of Christianity that has survived and maintained religious dominance to this
Mm-hmm.
day, must be, as a logical consequence, be false.
Right.
So,
Right, it must be false
you know,
because they were teaching. Actually, the earliest teaching in the church was that we actually have writings, and Bart Ehrman's pointed this out, where they actually determined this group of people, which I believe were Cerinthians, but I'm not going to get into that. But
hmm
these people basically were teaching that the world was going to end in 180 A.D. actually, and Irenaeus starts writing in 177, and through his writings, when you look through the 5 books, his eschatology heightens all the way to book 5, which is why I believe. Um, I mean, they say he wrote between 177 and 196 in the reign of Commodus, or 180 to 196, but I believe he wrote between 177 and 180, and he finished by 180 all 5 of the
hmm
books. And if he did write all 5, which it's up for debate. It could have been only 4 of them, or 2 of them even. But either way, if he did write all these 5 books, he was done before then because he believed the world was going to end in 180.
hmm
And when it didn't, he probably looked like a moron at Rome.
right.
They believed 150 years after the death of Jesus, the world was going to emphatically come to an end, which is one
hmm
of the most pseudoscientific things you could ever say. Even at the time, people would have said this is pseudoscientific rubbish.
Right.
Especially the Stoics. The Stoics would have been like, "Are you serious?"
No, no, I don't think so.
Yeah, and
Uh,
so that's explicitly stated and it might have been the Epistle of the Apostles. I don't want to say because I don't remember. There's so many little details, and I've gone back and forth through like something like 400 different writings, so it's hard to remember them all. But
Mm-hmm.
that belief was definitely around. It definitely was associated with Irenaeus. So when the world didn't end in 180, I'm sure there was some kind of problem. That might have been why the Christian lady assassinated Commodus,
Hmm.
thinking it would
Right.
happen.
Right. Right.
She's like, well, it's just 10 years late. Oh, and then Irenaeus, you already catch him. Maybe he did write after 180 because you catch him making up the lie that Jesus lived into his 40s.
Mm-hmm.
So that would explain why he needs that extra 10 years. Oh, it's going to happen in 190.
Mm-hmm.
It's in 190. So there's a debate going on at Rome at that time with different presbyters. You had Florinus, who was a Valentinian, Blastus, who created a schism. You had a man named Caius, who was around at the time of Pope Victor, debating with Irenaeus,
Mm-hmm.
debating directly with him. And you had another man named Proclus who was there. Likely Tertullian was participating in these debates too, as he lived in Rome at the time, and he was a jurist. He was famous. He was like the Augustine of his time. Augustine borrows a lot of ideas from him too, and so you even had Hippolytus who was alive, who was around then. Um, you even have a record that men like Eleutherus or Eleutherius in different texts, who was a pope at the time, a bishop in Rome, um, when Irenaeus first starts writing, he was a
Mm-hmm.
deacon to one of the preceding popes. I think it might have been Hyginus or Anicetus or something, but he was a or Soter. He was a bishop to, or he was a deacon for one of them. So he was in the church for a long time, and he was in a position of power for quite a while. Once they created this electoral system of electing popes.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that gets lost. And what these guys, one of the central things they were debating about was actually the Book of Revelation, which was lauded as a forgery. I mean, Caius was outright in saying, no, this is a forged piece of nonsense, rubbish. We know who wrote it. His name's Cerinthus. I mean, it's common knowledge around here. But at the
Mm-hmm.
time, there was a massive surge of pagan converts, so you have to keep that in mind. The laity that was coming in, the people that were now being appointed as priests and stuff, uh, they had no idea of those things, and they were in danger of following them. And I would have had no problem following them because it's loaded with Egyptian paganism.
Right.
Like the general resurrection, the carnal resurrection, this idea of everlasting torment, and all this. There's a lot of very Egyptian things in there that are very appealing to pagans.
Right. Right.
The harrowing of hell and
Mm-hmm.
all those kind of ideas that you find in the Acts of Pilate. But
Right.
so those are these archons, these bishops and stuff, and the Gnostics very much saw them as possessed by these archontic spirits, these
Mm-hmm.
ruling spirits, these basically higher demons. The
Mm-hmm.
bishops and the people that were possessed by them are kind of like the lower demons, and there's these higher demons, and you know they didn't see these angels of the Old Testament as angels. They saw, um, in a sense, true true Gnostic saints that died that were now in the Pleroma as true angels, guardian
Mm-hmm.
angels, not these counterfeit lower world material angels,
Yeah. Yeah.
who have to inhabit a body. They didn't see them that way. So archons were definitely a very threatening thing. Um, that and the Gnostics stress things like knowing how to dispel the archons and get rid of them and stuff, through different verbal formulas.
Yeah.
So
The second Apocalypse of James. I think it's the right one, but it talks about how the Savior instructs James how to confront these planetary gatekeepers. Of course,
right,
toll
the
houses.
toll houses that the Orthodox hate so
Yeah,
much.
and the archons pretty much prevent souls from rising to the upper aeons after death. It's kind
Right,
of in visionary sense, mysticism.
right.
So you have like
And that was stuff that was to be performed in this life. Like they had to learn it now, kind of like the Egyptians had to have stuff on the wall, but you had to know it by heart.
yeah, and like even certain souls like people like the so-called hylics or the sinners, they consort with demons while they're in the body.
Right.
So they basically fall under the Archon's power when they do that. So
Right.
and they turned around, they're cast into yet another body as a form of punishment or reincarnation. I mean, that's how the Gnostics kind of saw
And Paul,
reincarnation.
when his Gnostic comes out,
Right.
he says, "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in His mighty power. Put on the full armor of God." Notice he says, "In the Lord," and the Master is actually what it means. They translate this Lord on purpose in the
Mhm.
King James Bible and every Bible. In Greek, no Greek would have understood it that, oh, this is saying Yahweh. It says
Mhm.
Kyrios or Kurios, and what that means is master. It doesn't mean Lord. You could interchangeably, those words may mean something of the same thing in English, but the more proper way to translate it is master, because they called Jesus master. There's several texts where we see that. I think even the Gospel of Thomas has that. And it's the same word. It's used as Kyrios.
Mhm.
And so it says, finally, be strong in the master and his mighty power. So it's talking about Jesus. But it's more specifically actually not talking about Jesus' flesh, Jesus' spirit, so Christ, the Logos. Um, it says, put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the tempter's schemes.
Mhm.
And for our struggle is not against flesh and blood. Notice here he defines flesh and blood as literally what it says. Irenaeus
Right.
has to go through leaps and bounds to say
Well.
that this is not what Paul meant in 1 Corinthians 15, which it clearly is, because it's the only way he ever uses it.
Mhm.
And so when he's saying this, he's saying no, but against the archons,
Right.
against the authorities. So he redefines, he says, against the archons, who are the authorities. In this, he's actually making equative statements against the powers. Notice he calls them by all three of the names that are used. This
Mhm.
is where the Gnostic idea of calling them this comes from. Whenever someone says powers, they knew right away, oh, the authorities. Who are the authorities? The archons. The reason he uses authorities and archons is so he can show you where they have their physical parallel. Then he says, against the powers of this dark cosmos,
Mhm.
this ignorant cosmos, this devolved, deficient, empty cosmos, and
Right.
against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms, in the sky. Where are the heavenly realms? The planets going around. He's telling you, look, it's the planets too. The planets
Mhm.
influence these people. They're born under a certain star, like in Judas's gospel. So Paul's very much in line with that. So he thinks you have to have an armor of God.
Mhm.
But what he defines this armor of God as being a belt, a truth buckled around your waist, and all these other things. This breastplate of righteousness. It seems that these are kind of code words for having the certain things you had to say, like in the Apocalypse of James. And so a lot of these Toll House people, they get that out of this.
Right.
They see it there.
And I think the author of Judas was pretty much like a Pauline author, Pauline Christian. I mean, he
Yeah, very very
like
Pauline in a lot of
I mean,
ways.
and the message of Judas, besides the whole Satan thing, is like that Christ defeated the principalities and powers by tricking them into
Right.
crucifying the flesh, which is pretty much what Paul is teaching in Colossians and
Right.
First
It's not that
Corinthians.
he tricked them into sacrificing. See, that gets turned into the ideas later on atonement where the Orthodox go, well, that can't be because he can't be separate from that. So they have to take on this idea that, well, he tricked the devil into sacrificing him, but he couldn't really die.
Right. Like so, people they interpret it as the cross as some sacrificial appeasement for the Creator.
Right.
I mean that's what the Gospel of Judas is actually saying that that view is actually wrong. I mean,
Right.
that
He
the
definitely
idea.
did trick them into thinking they could have power over him and Gnostics
Right.
and stuff, and they could beat him and defeat him, but they didn't understand. Oh, he can leave the flesh whenever he wants. They didn't get that. They didn't get that
Right.
he was sent here on a rescue mission. That's the whole
Right.
thing. It's like it's this nine like creation dialed 911, and there he was the emergency rescue service. That's
Right.
essentially kind of the view they had on it. And there's an interesting thing too when you look in the Gospel of Luke, like they're talking about this beware the leaven of the Pharisees, or beware the leaven of the Sadducees, and this is their teachings. And
Mhm.
Josephus elaborates on what their teachings are and stuff like that. And they taught this carnal resurrection. They taught this idea that there was an everlasting prison under the earth, which is the idea of Hades or Tartaros among the Greeks, where the Titans are locked up. And
Right.
suspiciously enough, Irenaeus believes that the Antichrist is called Titan.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why they have this harrowing of hell, and Jesus has to go in the underworld. Well, I found something very interesting when I was looking at the testimony of truth. The testimony of truth is actually, I remembered now where I got the idea that it's not just from looking at Matthew and the Gospel of Nicodemus, but where I got the idea that the Gnostics viewed Hades as earth, as
Right.
material creation altogether, is Hades. And so it's actually in this writing. And it says here, the foolish thinking in their heart that if they confess we are Christians in word only, but not with power. In other
Mm-hmm.
words, not through the power of Christ, the one power, it's singular there. While giving themselves over to ignorance, to a human death, not knowing where they are going nor who Christ is, thinking that they will live. In other words, they think Jesus is Christ. They don't know that the Logos is Christ. They don't know his true identity. When they are really in error, they hasten towards the principalities and authorities.
Right.
So notice it calls them that because the powers were dethroned by Christ in the Gnostic scheme of things. So they fall into their clutches because of the ignorance or agnosis that is in them. For if only words which bear testimony were affecting salvation, the whole world would endure this thing and would be saved. They would have already been saved. But it is in this way that they drew error to themselves. See, for the Orthodox, they believe that, well, we're going to be saved because Jesus is going to come back again. But the
Mm-hmm.
thing is, Jesus isn't going to come back again. If he came back again, the Jews would kill him all over again. The thing is that with the Gnostics, they believe that the only way the world can be saved is once everyone accepts Gnosis.
Right.
That's the restoration. That's the whole mission of the Gnostics. That's why they have to evangelize, and they had to do it in secret to some extent, but they had to do it because that was their belief. Like, this material cosmos has to come to an end. We have to save as many people as we can before it's over.
Right.
And that's why Gnosis is so much more beautiful than this Orthodox teaching, is because it actually is looking to just communicate, sit down,
Religion.
have lunch together and talk.
Yeah.
It's not this thing where it's like, no, you fucking do this, do this, do this, do
Yeah.
this.
It's all legislative kind of thing, like the law.
Right.
You have to obey the law. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we have to kind of end this pretty soon because my computer is actually about to die. But
All right.
I think in our next video, I want to discuss the archons a little bit more and maybe the subject of Docetism because I think the subject of Docetism pretty much kind of dovetails in the archons and how Christ kind of fits into this whole scheme of things.
I think this went pretty good, but let me just finish. I want to get one more thing in.
Okay.
In the testimony of truth, also you have the idea where at the beginning he says, "I will speak to those who know to hear, not with the ears of the body, but with the ears of the mind. For many have sought after the truth and have not been able to find it, because there has taken hold of them the old leaven of the Pharisees and the scribes of the law. And the leaven is the errant desire of the angels and the demons
Right.
and the stars. As for the Pharisees and the scribes, it is they who belong to the archons who have authority over them." So that's interesting too, because Irenaeus does something really tricky with this. So this is what I had prepared earlier on here. Is
Okay.
Irenaeus says, "Vain also are the Ebionites, who do not receive by faith in their soul the union of God and man, but who remain in the old leaven of the natural birth." So he's talking about how they don't accept the virgin birth or something like that, And he's saying
Mm-hmm.
that the old leaven is thinking that no one could be born of a virgin,
Right.
which is not at all what Jesus says. Irenaeus is not even in line with them, and he has to make Jesus 40 years old, and people wondered why. Well, I just dispelled the whole problem. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I think we did good. I gave a lot of insight into what Irenaeus is actually doing and what Revelation was doing, things that I never even thought of before.
Yeah, he does tend to twist the gospel and Paul a lot. It
Oh,
just
yeah.
kind of fits his own prejudices. I mean, he does this a lot. I mean, he does it every chance he gets, really. I mean,
Yeah, he goes through leaps and bounds and hoops and
yeah,
hurdles to make possible.
yeah,
So I think we ended up with a good chunk of information here that would definitely fit in well on my channel.
yeah. I think we did pretty good. I think I might just kind of post this on my blog just to get people to see, like, I actually have a face.
Yeah, that'd be good. Probably give you
Yeah,
better publicity. I'll put it on mine too.
yeah. I think I'll just do that. But
Yeah, I think this would be good. Who knows? Maybe eventually we can get a guest that we can pick their brain.
yeah, definitely. We have like get maybe a scholar or I don't know, it's anybody. I mean,
That'd be
anybody
awesome,
really.
man. Wait, well, who knows? Maybe if
Who
we can
knows?
ever get someone on that's we'd have to actually write out questions though.
Yeah, I'll make it a little more formal. to get so they can feel a little more comfortable, I guess.
Yeah.
Instead of like two strangers kind of saying whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's definitely do this next time. I think our next episode should be more about Docetism and how Christ kind of
Yeah.
fits into
I think
Christianity.
we covered the Archons good enough
Pretty
without
well.
getting too
Yeah.
much into the details of names and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And we can revisit that later another time. But yeah, let's do something on Docetism next time. That'd be awesome.
Yep.
I'll prepare for that and write out some notes on it. And then
Yeah.
we should do one on Satan later
Yeah.
too.
Yes. Yeah. The whole idea of Satan, I think, is pretty
What
interesting.
Elaine Pagel's like her little joke about the social history of Satan. We can kind of give a little
Yeah.
social history of Satan.
Yeah. Also, a little side note. I think Elaine Pagels wrote a really good article on how she equated the bishops of Rome with the demiurge and the archons. I mean, she does a really good job with that.
Yeah.
I think I actually might post the article on my blog, or maybe you can post it. I think I can find it somewhere. But anyway, let's
We could always make a joint blog where we both have the password, and we could put this on there
oh,
with that article.
yeah. But anyway, I think we did a pretty good job, and I think we should keep making really awesome Gnostic videos.
All right, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. If you're tuning in, to obviously no one caught us live because this is the first. Oh wait, we actually have 2 viewers. Wow.
Nice. Awesome.
I didn't notice that. Maybe we had one person viewing us the whole time and didn't even know it.
Cool.
Well, someone viewed us and apparently they enjoyed it because they're still here.
All right, cool.
This is our last little second here at Aeon Arcanum, and we hope you tune in again whenever we do choose to actually broadcast again. It might be in the next week, could be in the next couple days. Who knows? We're kind of doing it on a whim right now. Anyways, James at Pandeer's Box.
Alex.
And at Crimson Corpus, and you can catch this on Pandeer's Box at youtube.com, and hopefully we'll have a blog up and running for this eventually. Anyway, may Gnosis lighten your path.
Peace out.
Okay, I hit in broadcast, so hopefully it ended.